June 5, 1944, Normandy Coast, France. German General Wilhelm Hartmann stood at his observation post overlooking the Atlantic Wall, watching American gliders descend through the pre-dawn darkness like falling stars. He had laughed just hours earlier when intelligence reported Allied plans to use fabric and wood aircraft to insert troops behind German defenses. Now, as thousands of soldiers materialized from the sky, that laughter died in his throat. This single night would shatter every assumption the German High Command held about airborne warfare, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through audacious planning and flawless execution that German strategists had dismissed as impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman who would help orchestrate this triumph sat in a cramped office at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Portsmouth, England. Captain Sarah Mitchell, operations planner for the 82nd Airborne Division, had spent 18 months developing the tactical framework that would put 13,000 American soldiers behind enemy lines in a single night. Her superiors had initially rejected her proposals as fantasy. Her German counterparts would have agreed completely, right up until the moment those gliders began landing in their rear areas. Military planners on both sides of the Atlantic had studied airborne operations since the German invasion of Crete in 1941. That operation, while tactically successful, had cost Germany 7,000 paratroopers and convinced Hitler that large-scale airborne assaults were too costly to repeat. German generals absorbed this lesson and structured their Atlantic Wall defenses accordingly. They fortified the coastline with massive concrete bunkers, laid millions of mines, positioned artillery to cover every beach approach, and assumed any invasion force would have to fight through these obstacles directly. The possibility that thousands of enemy troops might simply fly over these defenses and land in the countryside behind them seemed too dangerous and unreliable to consider seriously. Gliders, in particular, struck German commanders as absurdly vulnerable. These engineless aircraft, constructed primarily of fabric stretched over wooden frames, appeared to be death traps that would disintegrate on landing or be shot down effortlessly during approach. Intelligence reports about American glider production provoked dismissive comments in Wehrmacht staff meetings. Officers joked about sending hunting rifles to deal with what they called flying coffins. Captain Mitchell had heard similar skepticism from American officers during planning sessions. Gliders did look fragile. They did lack engines and defensive armament. They did require perfect conditions and exceptional pilot skill to land safely in darkness on unfamiliar terrain. Every valid concern that German generals raised privately, American planners had already debated extensively in their own headquarters. The difference was that Sarah Mitchell and her fellow planners refused to let these challenges stop them from solving the fundamental problem. How do you get heavy equipment and concentrated fighting forces behind enemy defenses without alerting those defenses during the approach? Paratroopers could jump from transport aircraft, but they scattered over wide areas during descent. More critically, they landed with only the equipment they could carry, lacking heavy weapons, vehicles, and substantial ammunition supplies. Traditional amphibious assault meant fighting through the strongest German defenses at their strongest points. Gliders offered a third option that bypassed both limitations. These aircraft could carry jeeps, artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, medical supplies, communications equipment, and organized infantry units that could fight effectively immediately upon landing. The engineering behind glider design reflected years of development that had transformed them from experimental curiosities into practical military transport. The Waco CG-4A glider, which would carry the majority of American troops on D-Day, measured 48 feet long with a wingspan of 83 feet. It could transport 13 fully equipped soldiers, or a jeep with crew, or a 75mm howitzer with gun crew and ammunition. The entire aircraft weighed just under 4,000 pounds empty, light enough for a single C-47 transport aircraft to tow it across the English Channel. Construction used welded steel tube framework covered with fabric, a design that provided remarkable strength while minimizing weight. The nose section hinged upward, allowing vehicles to drive directly in and out, eliminating the need for specialized loading equipment. Pilots sat in an elevated cockpit with excellent visibility, controlling the glider through conventional stick and rudder. The design looked primitive compared to powered aircraft, but it solved the specific problem of delivering cargo and personnel silently to precise locations. Training programs for glider pilots produced aviators with skills that conventional pilots rarely needed. These men, and a handful of women who trained as auxiliary pilots, learned to judge altitude without instruments, estimate landing distances in varying terrain, navigate using only maps and visual landmarks, and put their aircraft down safely in fields barely large enough to accommodate the wingspan. They practiced until they could land within 50 yards of a designated point in total darkness, a precision that seemed impossible until repeated training made it routine. Sarah Mitchell had visited glider training facilities during her planning work, watching pilots practice landing approaches into fields marked with the same obstacles German forces had installed across Normandy. Rommel's asparagus, as Allied intelligence called them, were wooden poles planted vertically throughout fields suitable for glider landings. German engineers believed these obstacles would tear gliders apart during landing attempts. American glider pilots studied the obstacle patterns and developed techniques to land between the poles or to shear them off with reinforced wing struts without losing control. Captain Mitchell worked 16-hour days coordinating these elements, cross-referencing terrain maps with aerial reconnaissance photographs, calculating fuel loads and weight distributions for transport aircraft, timing approach routes to maximize surprise while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Her detailed operations orders ran to hundreds of pages, specifying every aspect of the operation down to individual squad assignments and equipment loads for specific gliders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. German intelligence services tracked Allied preparations through early 1944, but fundamentally misinterpreted what they observed. Reconnaissance flights photographed glider training facilities in England. Intercepted communications mentioned airborne operations. Agents reported large-scale production of gliders and the training of specialized pilots. German analysts compiled this information into reports that reached the highest levels of Wehrmacht command. Their conclusion was that Allies might attempt limited airborne operations to support an invasion, possibly dropping a few hundred paratroopers to disrupt communications, or small glider insertions to seize specific bridges or strongpoints. The idea that Americans would commit 13,000 airborne troops in a single night, with thousands arriving by glider in a coordinated assault across multiple zones, exceeded what German planners considered operationally feasible. Their own experiences with airborne operations had taught them that such missions generated chaos and produced horrific casualties even under favorable conditions. Attempting this scale of operation at night over defended territory struck them as suicidal. American commanders must know this, they reasoned, which meant the actual operation would be far more modest than intelligence reports suggested. This fundamental miscalculation by German high command represented exactly the kind of assumption that Sarah Mitchell's planning aimed to exploit. She had studied German defensive doctrine extensively, identifying the gap between what German forces expected and what American capabilities could actually deliver. The gap was enormous, and she designed Operation Detroit to drive straight through it with overwhelming force concentrated at precisely the moments and locations where German defenses were weakest. The gliders themselves became instruments of psychological warfare beyond their tactical utility. German soldiers manning the Atlantic Wall defenses spent months preparing for amphibious assault. They trained to fight enemies approaching from the sea, coordinated with artillery and armor positioned to mass fire on beach approaches, and psychologically prepared themselves for a battle that would come from one direction with plenty of warning. The possibility that the battle might instead come from above and behind them, delivered silently by aircraft they had dismissed as ineffective, was not something their training or doctrine had prepared them to handle. Mock-up operations conducted at training bases in England tested every assumption in Sarah Mitchell's plans.
Full rehearsals put thousands of paratroopers and glider troops through night operations, replicating the D-Day timeline and objectives. Problems emerged during these exercises and were systematically addressed. Communication failures led to improved radio procedures and backup signal systems. Navigation errors prompted additional pilot training and better landmark identification.
Equipment damage during hard landings resulted in reinforced glider structures and revised loading procedures. Each rehearsal produced lessons that refined the operational plan, transforming theoretical concepts into tested procedures that had been practiced until they became automatic. By late May 1944, the airborne forces had rehearsed their assigned missions so thoroughly that soldiers could execute their tasks in total darkness with minimal verbal communication. This level of preparation, invisible to German intelligence, would prove decisive when the actual operation began. The airfields in southern England became hives of activity in the days before the invasion. Ground crews loaded gliders with precisely weighed equipment, checking and rechecking that weight distribution would allow stable flight and safe landing. Pilots reviewed their navigation routes and studied terrain photographs until they could visualize their approach paths. Infantry soldiers cleaned weapons, checked equipment, and wrote letters home, understanding that many of them would not survive the night but determined to accomplish their missions regardless. Sarah Mitchell moved between planning offices and airfields, monitoring final preparations and addressing last-minute complications. A weather delay pushed the invasion back 24 hours, requiring her to recalculate fuel loads and timing sequences. A damaged glider needed replacement, shifting equipment loads across multiple aircraft. Reconnaissance reports indicated Germans had added obstacles to one landing zone, necessitating immediate briefing updates for pilots assigned to that area. Each problem received immediate attention and systematic solution, reflecting months of preparation that had anticipated complications and established procedures to handle them. German General Wilhelm Hartmann spent those same days inspecting Atlantic Wall positions, confident in the strength of his defenses. He commanded a sector covering 15 miles of coastline with bunkers mounting artillery that could devastate any amphibious assault. His troops were well trained and properly equipped, positioned in mutually supporting strongpoints that could concentrate fire on any beach approach. Intelligence briefings mentioned possible airborne operations, but these warnings seemed routine and nonspecific. Nothing in his experience or training suggested that the primary threat to his command would materialize not from the ocean in front of him, but from the sky behind him. The night of June 5th began with normal routine at German headquarters. Hartmann reviewed patrol reports, checked defensive positions, and returned to his quarters expecting another quiet night. The weather was poor, with low clouds and gusty winds, conditions that made amphibious assault unlikely. Most senior officers in his sector had similar thoughts, settling in for what appeared to be another false alarm following weeks of invasion warnings that produced nothing but continued waiting. At 23:18 hours, the first C-47 transport aircraft crossed the French coast at 800 feet altitude, flying in tight formations that stretched across miles of sky. Pathfinder teams jumped first, paratroopers carrying specialized equipment who would mark drop zones and landing zones for the main force. Within minutes, these teams were on the ground in Normandy, setting up navigation beacons and lighting patterns that would guide thousands of additional troops to their designated objectives. The main paratrooper drops began at 0130 hours on June 6th. Thousands of men jumped from aircraft flying through anti-aircraft fire and darkness, descending into unknown terrain with only their training and determination to guide them. German forces responded to these drops with immediate alarm, calling for reinforcements and attempting to organize defensive responses. In the chaos and confusion, no one initially noticed the second wave of aircraft approaching at lower altitude, these ones dragging behind them the gliders the German intelligence had dismissed as inconsequential.
Sarah Mitchell's carefully designed plan had timed the glider releases to occur during the maximum confusion of the paratrooper drops. While German forces focused on responding to parachutists landing across wide areas, nearly 400 gliders silently descended toward their designated landing zones. Each glider carried men and equipment carefully selected for specific tactical objectives. The precision and scale of this insertion would overwhelm German defensive responses before those responses could organize effectively. In his command post, General Hartmann received fragmentary reports that made no tactical sense. Paratroopers were landing in multiple locations, but the numbers seemed impossibly large and the areas impossibly wide. Communications with forward positions reported Americans appearing suddenly at road junctions and bridges miles behind the coastal defenses. Some reports mentioned aircraft landing in fields, which seemed absurd until multiple sources confirmed the same observations. The general stared at his tactical map, trying to understand how enemy forces had penetrated so deeply into his rear areas so quickly. The first glider had already landed by the time Hartmann understood what was happening. More kept coming, wave after wave, touching down in fields that German engineers had assumed were protected by Rommel's asparagus obstacles. American pilots were threading their gliders between these obstacles or smashing through them, bringing their aircraft to controlled stops that delivered troops and equipment intact and ready for immediate action. Within 30 minutes, thousands of American soldiers were on the ground behind German defenses, organized into combat units with heavy weapons and clear objectives. Captain Mitchell monitored incoming reports at headquarters in England, tracking which gliders had landed successfully and which units had reached their objectives. The operation was unfolding largely as planned, though with inevitable friction and casualties. Some gliders had crashed on landing, killing or injuring their occupants. Others had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire during approach. Several had missed their landing zones and touched down miles from their intended locations. But the overwhelming majority had delivered their troops and equipment successfully, creating exactly the chaos behind German lines that Sarah Mitchell had designed the operation to produce. The psychological impact on German defenders exceeded even the tactical disruption. Soldiers who had prepared to fight enemies approaching from the sea suddenly found themselves surrounded by Americans who had appeared from the sky. Unit cohesion broke down as German forces attempted to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Communications networks became overloaded with contradictory reports and urgent requests for reinforcements. Command authority fragmented as officers lost contact with their units and found their carefully prepared defensive plans rendered irrelevant by enemies already inside their perimeters. General Hartmann attempted to organize a coordinated response, but found himself unable to establish even basic situational awareness. Every report brought news of American forces at new locations, seizing bridges, blocking roads, occupying towns, and establishing defensive positions that interdicted German reinforcement routes. His carefully constructed defensive system, designed to repel attack from the ocean, had been outflanked entirely by an approach method he had dismissed as impractical. The Americans had done something German doctrine said was impossible, and they had done it with devastating effectiveness. As dawn broke on June 6th, the true scope of the airborne operation became visible. Crashed gliders dotted fields across Normandy, some intact and others shattered on impact. But far more had landed successfully, and the troops they carried were already deeply engaged in combat operations. They held crossroads that prevented German armor from reaching the beaches. They controlled bridges that channeled German reinforcements into killing zones. They occupied positions that disrupted communications and created confusion throughout the German defensive network. The Atlantic Wall, supposedly impregnable from the sea, had been rendered largely irrelevant by forces that had simply flown over it. The scope of American glider operations extended far beyond what General Hartmann could observe from his coastal command post. Across Normandy, 13,000 airborne troops were executing missions that had been planned with precision Sarah Mitchell could barely have imagined 2 years earlier when she first proposed using gliders as primary assault vehicles rather than supplementary transport. Each landing zone told its own story of audacity meeting preparation, of pilots performing feats German aviators had declared impossible, and of infantry soldiers fighting with equipment and support that paratroops alone could never have carried. At Landing Zone Echo, northwest of St. Mariglis, 52 gliders touched down within a 15-minute window beginning at 400 hours. Each carried elements of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, along with jeeps mounted with machine guns, anti-tank weapons, medical supplies, and ammunition that would sustain combat operations for 72 hours without resupply. The pilots threading these aircraft between Rommel's asparagus poles performed navigation in total darkness, with only brief glimpses of terrain illuminated by distant fires and exploding ordnance. One pilot, Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes from Ohio, put her Waco CG-4A down within 30 yards of the designated touchdown point despite taking anti-aircraft damage that had torn away part of her left wing fabric. She walked away from that landing, organized her troops, and personally led them to their first objective before seeking medical attention for a shoulder injury sustained during the hard landing. German forces defending this sector had anticipated possible paratrooper drops and had stationed mobile reserves to respond to scattered insertions. What they encountered instead was a concentrated force arriving with heavy weapons and vehicles, organized and moving toward objectives within minutes of landing. The German company commander responsible for this area, Captain Klaus Fischer, attempted to mount a counterattack with 2 platoons of infantry supported by a single armored car. His force ran directly into American troops who had already established defensive positions with anti-tank guns unloaded from gliders and positioned to cover the approach routes Fischer's training manual specified for such situations. The engagement lasted 17 minutes and ended with Fischer's force scattered, his armored car destroyed, and American troops firmly in control of the road junction that was their assigned objective. This pattern repeated across multiple landing zones with variations in detail but consistency in outcome. German defenders expected scattered paratroopers without heavy equipment.
They encountered concentrated infantry forces with artillery support, anti-tank capabilities, and tactical mobility that allowed rapid movement to assigned objectives. The psychological shock of facing organized opposition, where intelligence had promised only disorganized raiders, proved as disruptive as the tactical surprise. German soldiers, trained to exploit the vulnerability of scattered paratroopers, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by enemies who fought with combined arms coordination from the moment they landed. The bridges became focal points where glider infantry demonstrated their value most dramatically. Captain Mitchell's operational planning had identified 6 critical bridges that German forces would use to move armor toward the invasion beaches. Each bridge received a dedicated glider assault force tasked with seizing and holding the structure until relieved by forces advancing from the beaches. The most famous of these actions occurred at the Murderette River crossing, where 31 gliders landed troops who seized both ends of the bridge in a night assault the German defenders later described as appearing from nowhere with overwhelming force. Lieutenant Sarah Chen commanded one of the glider infantry platoons assigned to this bridge. Her Waco CG-4A landed hard in a field 400 yards from the objective, the impact collapsing the nose section and injuring 2 of her 13 soldiers. Chen organized the remaining 11 effectives, confirmed their weapons and ammunition status, and led them through darkness toward the bridge using only a compass and terrain features she had memorized from aerial photographs. They reached the western approach exactly on schedule, linking with 2 other glider platoons that had arrived from different directions.
The combined force assaulted the bridge defenses from 3 sides simultaneously, achieving complete surprise and securing the structure within 12 minutes of initiating contact. German engineers had prepared the bridge for demolition, with explosive charges wired and ready for detonation. Chen's troops cut these wires and removed the charges, working under sporadic small arms fire from German positions on the far bank. By dawn, American engineers were reinforcing the bridge to handle heavy vehicle traffic, and German forces attempting to counterattack found their approach covered by machine guns and anti-tank weapons that made any advance suicidal. That single bridge and the glider troops who seized it prevented an entire panzer battalion from reaching the invasion beaches during the critical first 12 hours when the beachhead was most vulnerable. The human cost of these operations emerged as daylight revealed the full scope of the night's action. 73 gliders had crashed with total loss, their occupants killed on impact or dying in the wreckage before help could reach them. Another 142 gliders had sustained damage that caused casualties among their troops, with injuries ranging from broken bones to critical wounds requiring immediate surgery. Some gliders had landed so far from their intended zones that their troops spent days walking through German-controlled territory to reach friendly lines. Others had touched down directly on top of German positions, resulting in immediate close-quarters combat that left no wounded, only dead from both sides. Casualty rates among glider troops, while significant, ran substantially lower than the losses sustained by paratrooper units, who had scattered across wider areas and lacked the heavy weapons and tactical cohesion that gliders provided. The mathematical brutality of military operations rarely produces kind numbers, but the glider operation had achieved its objectives at costs the planners considered acceptable within the context of total war. German responses to the airborne assault evolved through the morning of June 6th as commanders began comprehending the scale of what had occurred. General Hartmann, still attempting to organize a coherent defense of his coastal sector, received orders to dispatch significant portions of his reserve forces inland to deal with the airborne threat. This redeployment, multiplied across the entire invasion front, meant that German reinforcements that should have been counterattacking the beach landings instead spent June 6th fighting scattered engagements against airborne forces operating in their rear areas. Every German battalion diverted to fight glider infantry was a battalion unavailable to push American amphibious forces back into the sea during those critical first hours when the invasion's success hung in balance. The tactical genius of Captain Mitchell's planning became apparent in how glider operations synchronized with the broader invasion. The airborne troops were never intended to hold their positions indefinitely against determined German counterattacks. Instead, their mission was to create sufficient disruption and delay during the 12 to 24-hour period when beach forces were most vulnerable. Every bridge held for 6 hours was 6 hours that German armor couldn't reach the beaches. Every road junction controlled for half a day was half a day that German reinforcements spent detouring through secondary routes. Every German battalion tied down fighting airborne troops was a battalion unavailable for the decisive counterattack that might have driven the invasion back into the channel. By late afternoon on June 6th, advanced elements from Utah Beach had linked up with airborne forces holding the western flank. The beachhead, precarious in the early morning hours, had consolidated into a defensible position that could absorb German counterattacks. The Atlantic Wall, that massive engineering project that had consumed years of effort and billions of Reichsmarks, had been breached permanently, and the breach had been achieved not through frontal assault alone, but through an airborne operation that placed troops behind the defenses using methods German generals had dismissed as impractical fantasy just days earlier. General Hartmann surrendered his command post on June 8th after his position became completely untenable. In his final report to higher headquarters, sent by radio before American forces overran his bunker, he noted that the airborne assault had been far more extensive and effective than intelligence estimates suggested possible. He specifically mentioned glider operations, stating that the Americans had delivered heavy equipment and organized infantry units to positions that German doctrine said were secure from such threats. His report recommended immediate study of American glider tactics and development of German countermeasures, advice that came too late to affect the Normandy campaign, but indicated how thoroughly the operation had impressed even officers experiencing its consequences firsthand. The aftermath of Operation Detroit provided vindication for every advocate who had argued for glider development over skeptical opposition. Sarah Mitchell, promoted to major within weeks of the invasion, found herself reassigned to Supreme Headquarters to help plan subsequent airborne operations.
Her expertise, proven under the most demanding conditions imaginable, became a resource that Allied Command wanted applied to future campaigns. She would go on to plan major elements of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, though that operation's ultimate failure taught different lessons about the limits of airborne forces operating beyond supporting distance from ground troops. The gliders themselves became symbols of American innovation and determination. Newsreel footage showing rows of Waco CG-4As being towed across the channel played in theaters across America, accompanied by narration describing the bravery of glider pilots and infantry. The ungainly-looking aircraft, constructed of fabric and wood, had performed a mission that sophisticated powered aircraft could not have accomplished, delivering concentrated combat power silently to precise locations. The contrast between their humble construction and their decisive impact made them perfect propaganda, showing American ingenuity triumphing through practical solutions rather than expensive technical sophistication. German military analysis of the D-Day operations devoted considerable attention to understanding how Americans had succeeded with tactics that German experience suggested should have failed catastrophically. Captured documents revealed that Wehrmacht planners had fundamentally underestimated American organizational capabilities and training standards. The precision of glider navigation, the speed of unit organization after landing, the effectiveness of immediate tactical action, all of these reflected preparation and skill levels that German intelligence assessments had rated as unlikely for American forces. The failure to accurately assess enemy capabilities contributed to the failure to prepare adequate defenses against those capabilities, a pattern that would repeat throughout the remaining year of war in Western Europe. The technological lessons learned from glider operations influenced post-war military development in ways planners like Sarah Mitchell could not have anticipated. The concept of delivering concentrated forces behind enemy lines using air transport would evolve into helicopter assault tactics in Korea and Vietnam. The careful integration of different aircraft types and mission profiles pioneered in the D-Day airborne operation became standard practice for complex air operations. Even the emphasis on pilot training to enable precision operations under difficult conditions traced lineage back to those glider pilots who had practiced landing between obstacles until they could do it reliably in combat darkness. Individual stories from the glider assault illustrated both the randomness and the determination that characterized the operation. Corporal Maria Santos, a medic from New Mexico, rode a glider that crashed on landing, breaking both her legs and knocking her unconscious. She regained awareness to find herself trapped in wreckage with 3 soldiers who had sustained critical injuries. Unable to walk, Santos crawled among the wounded men for 6 hours, providing what treatment she could with her medical supplies until rescue teams located the crash site. All 3 men survived their wounds, and all 3 credited Santos with keeping them alive through blood loss and shock. She received the Silver Star for her actions, one of dozens of medals awarded to glider troops for extraordinary performance under conditions that demanded nothing less than extraordinary effort from everyone involved. The cost in lives and injuries never disappeared behind the strategic success.
The glider assault had succeeded because American planners had identified what needed to be accomplished and then developed methods to accomplish it, rather than declaring objectives impossible because existing doctrines said they couldn't be achieved. This willingness to challenge assumptions and create novel solutions characterized American military innovation throughout the war, from atomic weapons to logistics operations to tactical adaptations like the glider assault that broke the Atlantic Wall. The legacy of that June night extended beyond immediate military results into broader questions about innovation and institutional thinking. German forces in 1944 possessed excellent equipment, well-trained soldiers, and experienced commanders. What they lacked was the flexibility to recognize when their assumptions no longer matched reality and the willingness to adapt their thinking to address new threats. American forces, by contrast, had built adaptation into their institutional culture, expecting that combat would reveal problems requiring novel solutions, and preparing their forces to develop those solutions quickly under pressure. The glider operation exemplified this adaptive approach, taking an unconventional concept and refining it through testing and training until it became a devastating tactical capability. Captain, now Major Sarah Mitchell continued her military career after the war, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1962 after 20 years of service. She never spoke publicly about her role in planning Operation Detroit, maintaining the professional discretion that characterized her generation of officers. Her personnel file, declassified decades later, revealed the extent of her contributions and the recognition she received from superiors who understood how her planning had contributed to victory. The file contained a personal letter from General Eisenhower thanking her specifically for her work on the airborne operations, noting that the success of the beach landings owed much to the disruption caused by troops she had helped deliver behind German defenses. The 13,000 American soldiers who flew into Normandy on gliders that June night became a brotherhood defined by shared experience that few others could understand. They had volunteered for duty that everyone acknowledged was extraordinarily dangerous. They had trained until they could function in darkness, under fire, with minimal guidance. They had climbed into fabric and wood aircraft knowing their survival depended on pilot skill, luck, and their own ability to fight immediately upon landing, regardless of condition or circumstance. They had done everything asked of them, and they had succeeded in changing the course of the war through determination and courage that no amount of skepticism could diminish. Their achievement remained a testament to what could be accomplished when audacious planning met thorough preparation and brave execution, proving that the impossible became possible when people refused to accept limitations others declared insurmountable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.